computer.
Oh shit, okay.
And
Continue.
we handled it like pros this time. We didn't freak out. We were ready. Okay, and then I'm gonna share a screen. Okay, and then I'm going to go to, how do you, oh no, I clicked the wrong button. That's not going to take me to the.
I like how the graphic design of this course is progressing slowly.
Thank you. I feel like when I watch a professor like that's unable to present the PowerPoint, that's like, oh, I see what's happening. Our friend is covering the present button. When I see a professor go through this, I'm always like cringing, like I'm like, hurry up and do it. But when it's you, it's like, I'm like so much more merciful to myself.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm like, hey, take it easy. It doesn't have to be, you can take a couple minutes. Okay, let me. Okay, so yeah, animals in history. So these three, I paired, or I didn't pair. I grouped these three texts because I thought that they made us think about history in different ways. And one thing, I guess, to reiterate what I've been saying since the first day, is that like, what's fascinating to me about animal studies in Islam is not the literal study of animals in scripture, but how animals become like a connective tissue, or you might say a hermeneutic, which is like religious study and also other fields for interpretation. So animals like become one way of uniting maybe disparate kinds of ways of looking at history and looking at religion. And so in this case, um, I wanted to, oh, I was going to add a third theme here, but I never figured out how to word it. And I left a blank for it and I didn't come back and put it in. Okay. So one thing we're going to be looking at is animals' presence in history, which is okay, like in like Muslim, in specifically a Muslim society, we're in Ottoman Egypt, right? Like what were animals up to? How do we think about, like, how did historians write about animals? What made them relevant for a historian to preserve and document stuff about animals? So that's like one conversation. The other conversation is like animal as method, right? Like that, like animal, like is actually going to get us, maybe cut us closer to a question. If you're coming at, right, and this is maybe elementary studying of history, is like, people say history is written by the victors, and you complicate that, nuance that a bunch, and then you get to like the academic study of history, which I don't really do a ton of. I'm not a huge history fan. I barely ever study it myself. Like, but and I think looking at history through animals has been the most interesting history has been to me. But the study of history is interesting because it gets so fraught so fast, and by the time you get to like contemporary history, like there's so many schools of thought. I mean, you might even, people, right, you argue like Marx is all about history, right? Like historical materialism. And so like once you start thinking about like history post Marx and post Hegel and post, like, once you start, basically it's like a very fraught field. It's a huge field. People are being scientific about it. People are being all sorts of different ways about it. And so I can get lost in the sauce very easily there. And I personally like disciplines that are a little bit more like reined in than like a lot of history is kind of like figuring out, you have to kind of do the meta question and the question at the same time. As opposed to like Marxists who do art, like they don't really have to do the meta question and the question at the same time. A lot of times you just like completely forget what we're, sorry, now I'm just being biased, but I'm like it's like if you're like a Marxist talking about film, like you can write 100 pages and never talk about one movie. You can write like 100 pages and never mention a movie. But historians almost like, they're always talking about like a thing that they're claiming happened or something like that. And so there's always like this kind of framing. And like in theory that means like maybe I should like it more. But on the other hand, no, like I like I kind of like that you can say like we're doing the meta question and we're just gonna say like, all right, theoretically, what is a film, like from like a whatever perspective, a Marxist this or that. Anyways. So animal history was the first time I'm like, okay, you can really kind of like have 2 feet on the ground. You can be a materialist, and you don't have to get bogged down in questions about time and documentation and power. And then all of a sudden in animals, like you'll find that having 2 feet on the ground, you're discovering things it's almost like reinventing certain wheels that I was avoiding having reinvented. Like for example, like a big thing I've avoided for a long time is being somebody who takes Foucault very seriously. Not because like I think a lot of people do take him very seriously, and like that's cool. It's just like it seems like it's a lot. You have to wrap your head around it. You have to dedicate time to it, and it's like one thing at a time, you know. So, right. But then like I'm vaguely aware of his like ideas about power and all of that, and then you can like reinvent that wheel by looking at animals. You're gonna accidentally fall into like, oh, this is why people fixate on this question. Oh, this is why that question, right? So, looking at animals in this very kind of practical sense and like this sort of like maybe like a naive reading of history helped me like discover why certain questions are like first like kind of the first questions people have when they thought about history. So I wanted to maybe sell animal as a method of historiography here, is the paying attention to like animal, the relevance of the animal to the historian as a way of looking at whatever you're looking at, and as a way, also as like a comparative method if you wanted to do that. That third theme I was going to put there, what was it going to be? I'm trying to think of the three pieces and like think of like one final like duh animals, duh history. But the third one I didn't word it. I could never word it. I think okay. It was gonna be something like intellectual trajectories. Like a lot, there's like a lot of like little funny overlaps that happen. Okay, well, you know what? We'll discover it. As I said, we're gonna naively discover this theme. How about that? Okay. Okay. Yeah, so the first text to look at was The Animal in Ottoman History by Alan Mikhail. He's a historian at Yale right now. He's like kind of, the funny thing is he was like kind of a hotshot. And then this article came out, I think like last year, that just destroyed him. Like somebody just like I think three historians just like took him to task. And I think out of curiosity, I recently looked it up because I was like, am I uncritically like, yeah. Am I uncritically like being a proponent for this dude that just got, so yeah, how to write a fake global history. A historian from Yale, Alan Mikhail, blah, 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 blah. The book also modestly claims that it is an innovative, even revolutionary contribution to global history. And it's been widely acclaimed, right? The few reviews by competent scholars have not exactly shared this enthusiasm. Rather, they have suggested that the book has a number of errors of facts and logic, as well as serious misinterpretations. And that Mikhail, until now an environmental historian primarily of 18th century Egypt, is in fact less properly equipped to write on the. Okay. Anyways, what he wrote about and got criticized for was not the text that I presented, which is why I pulled this up. I'm like, am I presenting a text that's just been blown to bits? Like I should acknowledge that it's been blown to bits. No, okay, so yeah, he was. They're not blowing the bits. But anyways, I like his writing. And Tanya, I'll acknowledge. I'm gonna like break the fourth wall and acknowledge that you're the person on the call. And be like that preface is kind of interesting. I thought like I think he was engaging, like personable. Like again, like I don't really read a lot of histories, precisely because I get super lost in the sauce. I'm like, what? I know there's an argument. There's always an argument being made, right? And I'm naive, right? Like when I go to history, I'm like, I just want someone to tell me the fast facts, like what happened in this time, like tell me the story. But of course, in crafting that narrative, this is history 101. Somebody's making an argument out of it, and I always feel suspicious that I'm not seeing the argument, like I'm missing it. What I liked about Mikhail is he was so kind of upfront in person. You know who he is, you know what he's about. I know you read it, but I did want to read a little bit from his preface, right? I stepped in Teddy's shit at 9:17 p.m. I had just thrown out some watermelon rinds and was walking back from the kitchen to catch the end of a commercial break in the Egyptian melodrama that was all the rage. Something about a long lost son who had returned home after 20 years of working on ships around the world. Teddy was the most important creature in my family's apartment, and he wasn't happy that I was in town for 2 weeks. He barked and howled, tore apart some of my socks, and generally did all he could to make my life difficult. He was cute and curly haired. I admit it. I loved him. How couldn't you? And so he talks about these animals, and then he also goes on to talk. So yeah. Talks about his dog, but he also talks about it. Yeah, here. He suddenly pivots to, I killed a deer. I didn't mean to, but I did. and he has this kind of, he talks about Teddy, he talks about his deer, he talks about Cairo, and one thing I wanted to point to between these two stories, or what he's doing in this preface that kind of caught my attention. How about I'll put it that way, is that the animals are always present in like a bunch of other material stuff happening around them. They aren't objects in the setting, and he really makes these animals almost kind of like so okay, like how does he mention he's 3 species, right? How does he, and the species are human, dog, and that deer that he kills, right? But Teddy is known through his shit. And then he had just thrown out some watermelon rinds, right? Like that beginning of like just like of waste, or like excrement and like leftovers and trash, and like the production and consumption of what it means to be like an animal, like is to like, like that's where he starts with this, which is cool. And like I bring it up because like when you get actually into the sauce of the like matter, into the sauce of the matter, into the heart of the matter, right? What he wants to do with animal and Ottoman history, what he wants to do in this book, examine the changes in the human animal relationship to track the history of Egypt. What I really like about it is I understood what it meant to centralize like materialism outside of just the kind of like, because right, like, okay, and maybe for people who might not be familiar, I'll just say this as part of the video presentation too, that like that's like one of like that's like the Marxist contribution as far as I understand it, is like look at like material, like material conditions as the engine of history, as like the driver and the change of societies, and like going from feudalism to the Industrial Revolution, and right, like the development of capitalism and eventually communism, and like that whole like material conditions as the driver of history is kind of as far as I'm concerned, that's the punchline of the Marxist like story. Second time I'm doing this in a presentation, Tanya. Correct me if I'm wrong on the historical materialism bit. I did that at film theory, if you remember that, like 2 years.
Yeah, I do remember it. Yeah, no, I think I wouldn't add. Would I add anything? No. I think, yeah, it's like it's a reversal of like the received kind of like intellectual great ideas history, basically, rather than like men creating conditions create men, and that creates history, and then men create history, but like as a product of their conditions which they create. So that's kind of like the wheel.
That's good. You're right. Like a good Marxist, you explain it in contradiction to something else, which is
exactly. Yeah.
exactly. Like,
oh, putting him on his head.
Yeah. Makes more sense in contradiction to great ideas, great man history. Yeah. So, and this is like, again, like, yeah, so it's like murky water for me, right? I'm like, what's the actual punchline in those worldviews? And one thing I liked about the animal and Ottoman history is that he's like tracking the human animal relationship, but he isn't tracking the theory of the human animal relationship like other things I might have been exposed to, like an AP Euro when you're like a sophomore in high school. And they're like, and they tell you, this was like my favorite lesson to learn in history as a kid, was like, oh, like up until, I don't know, it was something like the 1750s or something, Europeans thought of babies as just little human beings. And then one day they decided that children existed and that they were like a distinct, like sort of like category of human being. Childhood exists. And like the discovery of childhood, it can be reflected in art. Like that's the first time I'm like, oh. And so that's maybe an example of something that Marx is maybe pushing against a little bit. That like people had an ideological shift about children, and thus they're painted differently. Like it's less that story of like people's ideas somehow like crafting these, like, and history is more importantly looked at, well, like what were kids like? Did kids have jobs and then suddenly not have jobs? Like,
exactly. Yeah, it would be, yeah. I don't know anything about the history of childhood, but yeah, it would probably be like what changed in kids' contribution to labor, like that kind of thing, like would be the question.
Yeah. And so anyways, like for me, like this book was really cool because it's using the animal and Ottoman history to understand these changes in Egypt, but it's really framing the animals and their like kind of the fact that they're materially animals. We can look at the intro for half a second too. that in the period that he's studying, and he's studying from 1517 to 1882 in this book, right? And the period that he's studying, Egypt transitioned from a society characterized by intense human-animal interaction to one in which this relationship was no longer the basis of commercial and social life. I mean, it was agrarian, right? In like 1517, right? And not just agrarian. As he says, Egypt was home to the world's first zoo, circa 2500 BC, and one of the oldest religions to incorporate animal forms, and perhaps the first domestic dogs. So he's, again, this is maybe what you might criticize about Mikhail, because that's kind of like a sweeping thing to do. But for the period that he's talking about, it's very interesting that like that where he's starting off, animals are part of everything, because for like one thing he'll talk about is like bringing grain into town, bringing grain into Cairo. Like animals are the ones bringing the grain. They're doing so much labor. And in the shift that he's looking at, modernization, human beings are taking on more and more labor. Animals are doing less and less labor in terms of productivity, right? And animals are kind of becoming objects because they're no longer like, because we're starting to think of labor as something that is primarily done by human beings. And then so labor is somehow like a kind of subjective position. And so like this, like, so these kind of shifts are happening. And again, like you can do this conversation and like kind of have a salon about it, but like, rather than tell the story as a story of ideas, it's like, this is a story that's told in like in exchanges and documentation of like how many calories, like what is the like caloric, like what's that word, caloric share, right? What are the shares of calories, I guess? Yeah, like how where are calories going,
I guess. Yeah,
among like, you know, like how many like, as we noted before the recording started, right, is like at one point he notes that as many calories were going to okay, wait, no, let me get there. I want to get there after talking about something else first. But the result of this transition was a fundamental reordering of political, economic, social, and ecological power. This book thus explains one of the most important historical transformations of the last 500 years through the story of changes to some of the most historically significant human relationships, those with other animals. And he's kind of got like a reason why he's being particular about Egypt as a region. And, you know, that's a story about how people like territory, land, empire, that's all fair and good. And maybe I'll skip over some of that for now, because there's like the three categories that he looks at in this book. Again, all really cool. You can think about domesticated livestock and oxen, water buffalo, donkeys, to show how rural labor fundamentally changed at the turn of the 19th century. So as I've talked about earlier, the caloric energy afforded by both human and animal muscle was wholly sufficient to make the countryside function. So that's one thing he's looking at. Then he also has a story about, you know, dogs. And that complicates, I guess, the fact that Muslims have always been sort of anti-dog. But again, I didn't want to dig in there. I think what I wanted to dig into today was the idea of charismatic megafauna. I think that's kind of the end of his story, if you're supposed to, if you were to put it on a timeline. But of course, these shifts are all happening in parallel. But the final group of animals the book addresses are charismatic megafauna: elephants, lions, and tigers, and maybe giraffes, hippopotami, certain kinds of birds, had been there for millennia. What he talks about is how empire starts to exchange, and the exchange of charismatic megafauna shifts from gift exchange, where it's like there's no like dollar value of like 3 elephants. Like it would be like people who had like, somebody who had like never even like thought about elephants that deep would now be confronted with like 3 elephants, and they'd be like, here, these are yours. And like it's a way of like consolidating power, sharing power, demonstrating power, to give somebody the gift of an elephant, right? Like that's like this kind of symbolic gift exchange that's very hard to quantify. And then he's kind of tracking like, oh, check it out, like things become more complicated when you start to quantify it. And basically he tracks the objectification of the charismatic megafauna as they become part of exchange, right? So let me see if I can find a good little line about this one. Oh, here's a good thing to note too. The empirical heart of this book relies on archival sources from the central repository of records of the Ottoman Empire, legal cases from rural Islamic courts, administrative documents, and some British, Maltese, Venetian, and Chinese archival materials. Trying to think. Yeah. Oh yeah, and this other little flag that I thought was very interesting was that until approximately the second half of the 19th century, the social world of almost all people was characterized by their near constant and necessary engagement with animals. But because of the transition, as Weber says, which I thought was a cool link here, right? Not because it's, but perhaps not purposefully, but not irrelevantly, identified the modern state as a human community. So like modernization as this sort of like, as again, Berger, disappearance of animals from daily life. But then he has kind of interesting stakes that I think he kind of shoehorns the stakes in here. But it's that livestock, just as livestock, dogs, and elephants were stripped of their constructive, social, and economic functions, so too were Egyptian peasants, the uneducated, the disabled, the poor, the sick, the criminal, and the itinerant, cut of productive, social, and economic realms later in the century. So as we talked about like last week, like, you know, I think when you talk about animals, you talk about power, and then people will immediately kind of go to these questions. Anyways, wow, I don't want to spend actually too much time lingering on the charismatic megafauna bit. It seems like we've already been talking like a little longer than I expected. Yeah, but yeah, I guess I guess I've summarized the text fine. Have I summarized the text fine? There's
Yeah.
I think any more would not be summary anymore. I would just be like iterating the text.
I feel like hermeneutics, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And we can get there at the end too. There is discussion after the lecture, and we can do, that's the point. So whatever. Okay, let's move on to because this is why is it so hard to switch slides? It's like very difficult. Okay. Okay. What the heck? Oh, here he is. Animals with Rich Histories. This was like a short article. But bless you, by Mahesh Rangarajan. He's a environmental historian. I think he went to Oxford, but he teaches somewhere in India. I don't remember where. And he's like a political commentator and environmentalist. And he's like Alan Mikhail, he comes from like the environmental history school of thought. Like he kind of tries to do the similar thing, but his pivot is pretty different from Mikhail's pivot. As Mikhail is like looking at like, okay, like Ottoman Egypt's development, modernization, and like the becoming a modern state, like he's looking still at like kind of human production and human consumption and human exchanges and the development of capitalism, and like kind of like the commodity, like the animal as a commodity versus the animal as labor, and like calorie flows. Like that's kind of like the methodology we're looking at there. Rangarajan is suggesting something entirely different, that like we look at animals as subjects with their own history that we are excluded from, the same way that we might exclude lions from human history. And then, but like the same way we would be wrong to exclude the lion would be wrong to exclude us. They're interweaving, but he kind of starts from that radical to say like, when we do the other, it's like weird too, right? And so he's looking at a specific forest called the Gir Forest in Gujarat. And the lions that got there, evolutionary, like the way they got there came from a hundreds-year-old kind of like migration problem. So like some sort of like land bridge, like isolated some small subspecies of lions in the Gir Forest. And the population has boomed and busted several times. They've been near extinction. And what's interesting to many historians about the Gir Forest lions is the relationship to administrative states, like the Mughal Empire, for example, and like how different Mughal kings had different relationships to these lions. Some of them thought it was very cool to hunt them down. Other people like really respected them in kind of a charismatic megaphone way, that they symbolized power. And then this takes on, right, like, you know, the lion takes on a sort of symbolic kind of like steward of the forest meaning historically for many Mughals and in Mughal art. Where did I put the Rangarajan? I hope I didn't. I can't, like, I literally can't find the PDF right now. Oh, here it is. So he suggests rather we look at animals with rich histories. I like this one line from the abstract. Although it's too far to endow the lions with historical consciousness, Gear's lions clearly do have memory of memories. And so what he's trying to investigate, and it's an article, a very short article. He's trying to investigate, like, okay, we think about consciousness in animals, we think about empathy in animals, et cetera, et cetera. And surprise, just like last week, rethinking animals as subjects make us remap human animal boundaries in emotive as much as ecological terms. So it's kind of the same point of departure as all that other stuff last week about speech and all that. But instead of thinking like, okay, like, because the speech question makes us think about our present, like it's like it's about animal presence, right? But animal history makes us like think about like it suddenly becomes a different sort of question. To possess a historical consciousness entails having a sense of the past in a self-reflective, possibly critical and analytical, coherent way or ways. Having a history or a sense of history entails a worldview. It may be going too far to endow a wild animal or any animal, in this case the gear lion, with such sense. On the path to historical consciousness, however, there first comes historical adaptation. This helps us to pose a somewhat more modest, though still very intriguing question. When and why did lions change the way they relate to and with humans? Was this behavior specific to a few lions and general to all people, or confined to certain people? So, and then he does tell the history. You know, the Babur, the first Mughal king, right? Like, there's no mention. Oh, wait, sorry. Right, there's no mention of lions in his memoirs, which is actually this is something, again, like, as somebody who doesn't really love history, like, this is one of those little pivots that's maybe common to historians, but I always think it blows my mind. The lack of mention of something in a text is like, it actually, right? This is something they say about Islam, that if there's like a Sharia ruling on something that says don't do this, it means that a lot of people were probably doing it because somebody had to come out and be like, no, we don't do this, right? Like for like partying at the Kaaba. I mean, right now it's like unthinkable that people partied like in front of the Kaaba. And I mean, like dancing, singing, hanging out, like having long talks. But it was actually so common, and that's, you know, and that drinking coffee close to the Kaaba was prohibited for a while because people were pulling all-nighters. So it's like it's just, you think like when something is strict, yeah.
It is like very like unrelated, but that's like a big historian thing too with like histories of sexuality. Like when you find, that's like Foucault, like one of Foucault's like big things of like finding all these like huge like 1,000-page like tracts of like don't do this thing, like it's perverse, like meant that a lot of people were doing it in like a time period that you wouldn't think. Yeah.
I've heard this called a negative reading of history. I don't know if that's, if you've ever, I don't know where that phrase comes from.
I feel like that has to do with critical theory. So it's like negative dialectics, but I don't know what negative dialectics are. I know it's some kind of like Adorno, like kind of
universal, particular. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Something.
Yeah. Something there.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah. So he talks about how the Mughals saw the lion as the Bacha, the keeper of order in the realm, same way that you think of a king. So one thing I like about Rangarajan is he does think about like the political, he's a little bit less materialist than Mikhail. in that he maps like political structure in this sort of like interpretive way. So I think this is maybe a good paragraph to look at for this. Indo-Persian chroniclers saw the lions as the equivalent of the Bacha, a keeper of order in the realms, meaning like, right, like the king, like how do you characterize authority or Badshahship, right? Is it like so he's the argument he's making here is that these chroniclers are positioning the Badshah as a keeper of order first and foremost, right? This was an idea in India where the animal was the Mrijindra. I don't know Sanskrit stuff that well. And the allusion to being the king of the gods, Indra, and to the animals or deer in particular in Sanskrit. Akbar especially asserted imperial divinity. What is important was that he was the keeper of order in nature. It was a strong and benevolent rule of the Badshah that was praised not only in the khutbah, the Friday sermon in mosques, that were maintained by the grants of revenue rights. This was especially important in areas like Bengal. Okay. We can skip some of this stuff. One thing I think worth looking at is this reign of terror that he finds kind of post-Mughal, where the rulers would like hunt the animals, hunt the lions, and we've lost Tanya. That is okay. I'm going to. Okay, I'll just continue. And hopefully they can come back. But I'll skip over the reign of terror and the lion plague. I think we should just do punchlines now. So one main punchline to looking at Rangarajan is that the stakes are really high for the animal's presence in the lion's presence in the Gir forest, for a couple of reasons. One is that the population of the lions has been so precarious with so many booms and busts, and the booms and busts he's mapped to human political economy, to empire, to the development of the state, to the administration, like to the different administrative functions of each state. So like if the king must demonstrate power through the hunt, the lion actually adapts to understanding that it is a hunted creature. And from there, that's basically his jumping off point into the meat of what he's arguing, which is that lions who may have never interacted with human beings in the Gir forest will have understandings of hunting paths, have understandings of shepherd zones, of where cattle are. They'll seem to know where to walk, when to walk. And not only that, there will be times when animals are willing to eat livestock and times when lions would not touch livestock. And he thinks that the model of socialization just doesn't fit with what actually happens to these lions. The idea that these animals are nurtured and not like nurtured by human beings, not nurtured in the literal sense, but nature versus nurture, right? That they've been socialized or trained, they've adapted kind of as individual lions. And he's reading a little bit of politics there, that like he's saying, look, it is an evolution, or he's taking as a premise the idea that it is not evolutionary, that the lion will avoid the places where the cattle are in some centuries and attack cattle like crazy in other centuries. That's not, he's taking it as not individual choice of the lion and not habituation or socialization because human beings shoot those lions, but rather that lions, again, remember, because I said sometimes we think about human history and we completely ignore animals. He's saying, completely ignore human beings for half a second. That lions themselves are interacting, that they have a history, that they have a culture that develops. that if we saw human beings some centuries, for example, avoid certain meats, we would call that a tradition. There is a certain area in the Gir forest that Rangarajan points to that the alpha lion of a group will walk like 2 laps around every day between its like 22 hours of sleeping. And Rangarajan points to how when the lion starts getting old, other smaller, younger lions start doing that walk with it. And it's a tradition. A lion's lifespan is about a third of a human's lifespan. So you think about like, okay, traditions that you've learned from your grandparents or you know about from your grandparents, and how that feels like a generational memory, and how, okay, well, what did my grandfather learn from his grandfather? Now we're starting to talk about things that happened like mid 1800s, things that my grandfather learned from his grandfather. I mean, history goes very deep like that with human beings. With a third of the lifespan, a lion is learning from its grandpa lion, like stuff that happened in the 80s. Not literally learning that stuff and not actually articulating it or verbalizing it in any specific way, but ride with Rangarajan and do the, what's it called? Reductio ad absurdum, right? Just assume the craziest for half a second and actually think in terms of tradition and culture. All of a sudden, we're being exposed to an entirely new way of thinking about these lions. These lions have rich history, that there's culture, that there's tradition, that there's adaptation, and that they're not just suddenly objects that are being administered differently by the state. Rather, they're subjects that are under the human state every time a different human being conglomerate conquers the Gir forest, whether it's like under the Raj, under the Mughals. And nowadays, and then this takes us to where the stakes are for him. Nowadays, the stakes are nationalism. The Gir lion, is a symbol in Gujarat of nationalism. And different groups, I'm not going to commit myself to, or commit, we don't have to commit it to one. There's different ways the lion has been mobilized in Gujarat towards different kinds of nationalisms, and it's not really fair to flatten them. Either way, though, it is a mascot of certain nationalisms in dangerous, violent ways sometimes, and liberatory frameworks otherwise. And so you have a strange meeting of minds when it comes to the Gir lions, because you have people who have all sorts of political tendencies suddenly fighting for the ecological conservation now of these lions. And that's why, there's Rangarajan's thing here. He's saying the human stakes here are very high, right? The way we think about these lions, people might say they're a danger. Some people still think of them that way, right? Like they're going to attack people with cattle, or they're going to attack the cattle, right? But then there's dangerous human beings. I'm calling them dangerous human beings. Maybe I'm revealing that I don't love nationalists in almost every scenario, right? but that this mascot is being mobilized in other dangerous ways, and yet Rangarajan himself he's a conservationist. He cares a lot. He wants these animals to survive. And so the idea of thinking of these lions not just as subjects of human states, but also as having their kind of alternative interpretation of new administrative frameworks. They, like any other subject, change with the political economy of the time. And that's the linking with Mikhail, right? The same way that the category that the donkey inhabits in 1517 is not the category that the donkey inhabits in 1900 Ottoman Egypt. In terms of sheer calories, in terms of how many calories are being dedicated and set aside for the donkey in 1517 versus in 1900, because in 1517 a donkey was labor, the same way a human being was labor. In 1900, a donkey was capital. Not literally, and we can we can be critical about this, right? But broad strokes, the allocation, that was the word I was looking for earlier. The allocation of calories is telling you something about the political economy and the shifts in political economy. Again, Rich Histories, animals become a hermeneutic, right? For understanding just the interpretation of this territory, the Gir Forest. Yeah, and this becomes, as any kind of national territorial flashpoint will be, becomes religious fast. But again, there's depth there. We don't need to go there because we have a third thing to look at: the angel with the ram. So Meyer Schapiro was a 20th century Marxist art historian. I wrote, he's a good art historian and a bad Marxist, because over the 20th century, there was a lot of Marxist art historians. And that's like a whole, as we were talking about earlier with like critical theory. So Meyer Schapiro kind of seemed to try to do it on his own. He was a Lithuanian, but he moved to the US very young in like the 1910s or 20s. By the 1940s, he was writing this art history. He was a medieval stuff. He studied medieval art in like Northern Europe, was like his specialty or whatever. But he was like politically a Marxist, but this was kind of, he was like trying to incorporate that into his art history. And I personally, like, he doesn't do it as well as any of his contemporaries do it, but he is a really interesting art historian to look at. So one thing he noticed, and I shared this article, it's from 1943. He noticed that in like medieval Irish art, you'll see medieval Irish art from like, I think as early, what 1200s. Let me pull it up so I make sure which Irish art. I don't know anything about Irish art, but what he was looking at is Irish art. Does he not have a year? Is that why I don't remember a year? Yeah, he doesn't have a year. All right, that's fine. That's fine. Oh, no. Okay, so we have some figures which are dated, right? Yeah. Like 1500s. What was this painting? Okay, point being, okay. He notices angels carrying rams in medieval Irish art in depictions of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. And he tries to pull on this thread and say, okay, like why does Irish art depict an angel delivering the ram to Abraham, when in Genesis 22, the ram is just kind of like gestured to as being stuck in a thicket, like stuck in a bush, with its horns. And in Christian art, I mean, pretty much as soon as Christian art becomes a thing, like iconography, I'm talking like maybe 400s, 500s, maybe even 300s, depictions of Abraham and the ram is always hanging on the bush, because right, the sacrifice is delayed, and Jesus would eventually be the sacrifice that God, whatever. So there's a whole Christian reinterpretation of Genesis, or let's not say there's a Christian interpretation of Genesis 22 that really centers the ram as a metaphor for Jesus and like the ultimate sacrifice. And so a lot of Christian depictions of the ram early on show the ram hanging on the bush, hanging. And then you suddenly have all this Irish art that actually has an angel carrying the ram in. So what Meyer Schapiro, and he doesn't really conclude, right? But what he's considering is how in the Islamic tale, first of all, it's not Isaac, but it's Ismail. And secondly, Meyer Schapiro calls Ismail the father of the Arabs, which is kind of like, yeah, like a lot of, that's another distinction that gets made all the time. That the depiction of the angel carrying the ram in doesn't just come from like Islamic thought in vague, like randomly, they didn't learn it, but there's actually a series of ways people learn from each other. It's kind of an intellectual history, but he's an art historian, and so his method involves looking at who painted what and when. And the reason I assigned it is because there's both like limitations and strengths to this. And kind of funny, I started with Mikhail because he's doing material history, but remember I like highlighted all of his sources. They're all they're all written, right? And so there's an irony in doing material history, not really looking at the materials. And art historians have this strength because they have what's material right in front of them. So here's a, let me rotate this. Now check this out. So you have, and this is obviously a Persian miniature from what? Yep, 1313. And you got the angel carrying the ram in. Now let's see if we can find, oh, hey, so here's a miniature from Rashid ad-Din's, I think what's it? I think it was like an encyclopedia about the world, like the ways of the world or something like that. So in this, there's also an angel bringing a ram. You can see Abraham about to sacrifice Ismail. So that's in the Islamic art. And now what he has here, is an Armenian gospel that has the angel pointing to the ram, as I said, hanging on a bush in a thicket. So yeah. In like gospel interpretation. Now, let me see if I can have, wait, where's the Jewish? Dang it. Okay, whatever. Point being that as an art historian, he had to interpret a lot of religious sources to understand the trend, and like kind of he has to sort of consider how Irish artists were even getting hip to it. And he has a hard time because yeah, he like isn't a religionist, and he was missing a really interesting set of connections that happen. I think we can start with the fact that he looks at Rashid ad-Din and like an illustration within Rashid ad-Din that shows the angel bringing the ram. One thing he doesn't talk about was that Rashid ad-Din himself was born Jewish and converted to Islam at the age of 30. And there was a lot of interplay, a lot of like the bound. Another thing to talk about when you study religion is that like boundaries are porous, open, and ever shifting. I think it's Otabari who was extremely his preservation and his interpretation of like Old Testament texts was really useful for, I think, a lot of Jewish thinkers. Now, this is me going off of like a pretty vague level of knowledge. And then you also have people like Ibn Ezra, right? Who is like a Jewish thinker under Muslim rule who was doing interpretation of like Genesis 22 around a lot of Muslims. So anyways, we have like this sort of interreligious kind of blossoming that happens because the people, like the interpretation of texts were happening like in parallel across religion in certain flashpoints, like whatever, medieval Spain, et cetera, et cetera. And it started very early, actually. Again, people sometimes think that that even now we're getting closer to a place where like religions can talk to each other or something like that. But actually the reification or the objectification or the idea that there are firm and kind of singular boundaries around religions is a pretty like novel concept. And that like, that doesn't mean that there was an allegiance and that the boundaries weren't always clear. The boundaries were very, very, very clear, administratively clear even, right? For example, you know, like you have to pay certain taxes or not pay certain taxes. You had other duties that you didn't have other duties, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm saying the sort of intellectual and interpretive boundaries were not so clear. And in fact, like you find a lot of really interesting, like 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, like Jewish scripture. There's the Midrash, what is it called? Okay, I'm not an expert in Jewish studies. There's a really interesting like rabbinical text that does involve an angel bringing a ram out of the Garden of Eden to Abraham as Abraham's about to sacrifice Isaac. And like, people didn't really understand how this where this interpretation kind of came from. Within that, I'm sure I'll pull up the PDF, and if anybody sees this and they want it, I'll find it later and I'll send it. It's like people could not account for where he got this interpretation of the angel holding the ram. And it's like non-Genesis 22. And then people will say, oh, the Muslims. It's not really in the Quran. It's like kind of in some exegesis of like Islam, of like hadith, and in some exegesis of the Quran, that like the ram itself was in the Garden of Eden, and that Jibril kind of rips out of time, and he rips through it's like you can almost imagine like ripping through time, and like he's grabbing that ram in the Garden of Eden like while Adam and Eve are there almost, and he pulls it directly in front of Abraham, right? And part of it is for Muslims, the connection between Adam and Eve and Ibrahim and Abraham is like very, very important, right? Because Adam first kind of what dedicates the Kaaba, then Ibrahim and Ismail dedicated together a second time, and then it's the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who comes and rededicates it that third time, right? So kind of there's this like kind of line, the Kaaba is shot through with the kind of these foundational moments for human history, or the Muslim view of human history, and the progression, right? Adam, Abraham, and the Prophet Muhammad, and it's shot through with this moment at the Kaaba, right? And so what better way than to say, okay, Abraham has Ismail, and Jibril, the very same angel that brings the word of God to the Prophet Muhammad, goes to the Garden of Eden, grabs this animal and puts it in front of Ibrahim, and saves Ismail that way. Isn't it interesting that it's almost kind of in parallel, or maybe in contra to that ram hanging from the thickets? It's saying, Abraham, hold up your knife, put it away. There's work to do. There's other stuff happening, right? So there's this kind of affective logic to this, to portraying Jibreel bringing the ram. The ram is tidings from Eden. Abraham is receiving tidings from Eden, through Allah, through God. Anyways, Shapiro doesn't write all this. Now I'm kind of going off. My bad. But this is like another view of history. This is what you might call sacred history. And it's a kind of view of history that gets neglected because it doesn't sit very well with the academic history. It doesn't sit very well with great man history. It doesn't sit very well with Marxist history all the time either. It's like, but it takes all of those, right? What it takes out of Marxist history is like the kind of teleological view. It's like, okay, there's like a logic to how time is unfolding itself. And that logic is very material. That logic is grounded in right? And so God and being are unfolding in this material way. And remember what we talked about with Arabi, right? Is that like everything material is being created and destroyed at every moment. And so you have this unfolding right in front of us, right? That is sacred history, right? And so you locate it. But the beautiful thing with all of this is this art historian has no background in any of this. He discovers, rather, by looking at Irish paintings, that wow, like Europeans in medieval times seem to be pretty convinced all of a sudden that angels were carrying the ram, and there's just like no basis for it. And he can only conclude that, well, let's go to his conclusions. I think he lists 5 conclusions very nicely. Yeah, here we go. What appears to be an accidental variant in the West, unmotivated by the Bible text, occurs in Muslim art regularly as a direct illustration of a well-known legendary account of the sacrifice. If this variant in Ireland is not inspired by Muslim oral, literary, or pictorial tradition, it may still be of Eastern origin, since the same idea appears in Jewish folklore, although not in Jewish art, since there is a considerable evidence of elements in Jewish folklore and apocryphal literature in England and Ireland. Now, I don't know if Myers-Leonard knew this, Meyer Schapiro, but there were, what's it called? There's temples that have tile depictions of the angel carrying the ram in on the floor. And it's Isaac, it's not Ishmael, it's Abraham with Isaac. And so it's very much like it's a Jewish, it's a synagogue. I mean, it's fully, you know, and it's, you know, this, I'm talking maybe you'll find these in like built like these tile floors. I think the discovery of one of these tile floors, it must have been built in like 1100 Eastern Europe. So it's kind of old, but it's post the Jewish rabbinical reinterpretation of Genesis 22 through Muslim commentary, because the preservation, I mean, Genesis 20, I mean, books in general are hard to find, right? Interpretations and exegesis of German so you would have you know, Jewish scholars trying to read Genesis 22, just read the text, but it would be, you'd have all these liner notes by Muslims around it, right? So so the architects of these tile floors were saying, okay, and you need to, by the way, you know, you need to have this angel carrying the ram in, because you know, and because the commentary, and the funny thing is, you know, they don't need to be reading this commentary, but they're taking that commentary into account. Anyways, that's something that Meyer Schapiro may not have known yet, because I don't know that if these tile floors were discovered or not in his time. So when he's calling it Jewish folklore but not Jewish art, actually, we might argue that there's evidence that this imagery is very present in Jewish art and Christian art eventually too. Even though the ram hanging on the bush is like kind of symbolically very important, you will find some Christian art where the angel is bringing in the ram. The Jewish legend had reached England by 1800. Okay. On the continent, the variant is concentrated in region rich context with Jewish Muslim culture, and several examples includes a minor detail, the grasping of the horn by the ear of the horn, that agrees broadly with Muslim literary accounts, but of which the significance is unclear. The adoption of the Semitic variant in southern France and Spain, which directly from Jewish or Muslim sources or indirectly by way of Al-Sun's text or Irish art, was possibly affected by native religious and artistic attitudes most evident in sculpture and Suilak. Okay, we didn't go into that, that's okay. Anyways, it's worth digging deep here because I've only kind of scratched the surface. But see, what I hope to have presented is three different kind of ways of doing history, right? One of them is it's based on archival texts that were for the most part practical, writing down how many barrels of grain were used to feed donkeys today and how many barrels of grain were used to feed elephants today, to track the priorities of the Ottoman Empire and to track production and consumption in Ottoman Egypt. That's like one method, right? And we might call it materialist. We would call it this, broadly it's environmental history, but it's like, I would call it, he's doing a little bit more political economy. He's looking at power, he's looking at demonstration and symbolic power, he's looking at gift exchange versus selling things. So he's looking at the objectification of the animal a little bit. One way. Another way to do it completely is to say, okay, what if these animals themselves have history? What if they're relaying to one another traditions? What if they're saying, you know, don't go there because historically, blah, 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 right? That's where you'll be hunted. Or don't go there because we kind of have a treaty going. Like, they're not going to bother us if we don't eat their cattle. We're cool with that. We have plenty to eat over here. So we don't bother those cattle, but actually we'll make a show of not bothering the cattle by walking this lap a couple times a day. And the tradition kind of pops up and the animals learn the tradition. So Rangarajan, kind of different from Mikhail, but he's still doing this sort of political economy question. But he's applying it just directly to the animal. And thirdly, we have the angel with the ram story, right? We have this way of looking at history, which is through the depiction of the descent of this animal from heaven. And like the ram itself is like can be seen as divine history ripping through time, right? Like the ram itself coming from Eden in front of Abraham and then being depicted as such, despite interpretation itself kind of being very complicated. And like Schapiro, Schapiro doesn't even scratch the surface of what somebody who isn't a art historian of like medieval Irish art, but somebody who's like really in this. Again, I'm not that person who's really, really into this. As somebody who's scratched the surface myself of like the history of Jewish and Islamic interpretations intermingling, It's a complicated question. Who's interpreting to and how and why? What books are resources to who? So these paintings are another way that material culture can inform history, and another way that, okay, like this ram can hold different kinds of significances and still kind of like those different significances can resonate in that singular image. The same way Jibril is going to bring the word of God to the Prophet Muhammad, Jibril is going to bring this ram to Ibrahim straight from Eden. Now, the Prophet Muhammad himself also has his ripping through time. So in the Mirage of the Night Journey, all this to say that like animals in history, complicated subject. I wanted to put these together in one session because I wanted to think like, okay, the same way animal made us think about speech differently, but in distinct ways, it was a connecting thread for different hermeneutics of like of the role of speech, right? We had Islam, we had like Ibn Arabi being like, well, like the word of God is what reality is, right? Like being is God's exhale, the exhale, the breath of mercy, right? And then we also all of a sudden also had we had Derrida on speech. We had, so that same way that speech kind of got like problematized, and then animals had us having these little frameworks. History itself can be super problematized, and animals kind of remind us, okay, are we centering humans? How are we centering humans? Are we centering production, consumption, materialism? What are the cogs of history? And yeah, we can go Marxist, we can go Foucault, or but if we aren't familiar with that stuff, we don't have to go there. We don't have to go there at all, because we can instead think, okay, like, are we mapping calories and making arguments that way, or are we reading texts? Because when we read texts, we have to make arguments about who's writing, who's reading. When we map calories, we have to make those arguments too, because somebody's writing it down, but it's a little bit different, right? Like, I mean, there's only so much you can say about how much grain is being used to feed elephants. You might argue that like, okay, they're exaggerating, but point is a certain amount of grain was being allocated to animals, and you can track that to see the like which animals are prioritized, which animals are labor, which animals are charismatic. And then finally, yeah, we have this ram story. So that's animals in history. And there is, of course, so much more to say. And if anybody wants to reach out to me to talk about any of the texts any deeper, I'd be really happy to. I could share other texts. Just let me know. Thank you for watching. Oh, that's not the end of recording. How do I stop the recording? Bye.